They say snow has a silence to it. A quiet that wraps around you like a thick blanket, muting the world outside. In a small town buried deep within Minnesota's icy winters, the snow wasn't just silent, it was alive. My name is Jake. And for the longest time, I thought I knew what winter was. To me, it was just a season, a time for holidays, hot chocolate, and the carefree days of youth. But one year, when I was 16, something happened. Something I don't even talk about to my closest friends. It started like any other winter. Snowflakes falling gently from the gray sky, coating the streets and rooftops. My friends and I built snowmen for fun, stacking chunks of snow into awkward shapes and laughing at how lopsided they looked. It felt innocent enough. But what we didn't know, what none of us knew, was that the snow itself had its own memory. A memory that didn't forgive. The first time I noticed something strange was one quiet night in late December. The wind had died down, and the snow-covered streets seemed frozen in time. I was in my room, staring out the window, when I saw it. The snowman we had built earlier that afternoon wasn't where we left it. It was closer, leaning toward the house. Its round, uneven head tilted just slightly as if it had been watching me. I remember laughing it off, telling myself it was just the wind. Snow blows around, right? But even as I said it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned away from the window, trying to focus on anything else. But then, the sound started. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the way old houses groan in the cold. But it wasn't coming from inside the house. It was outside, soft, deliberate crunching in the snow. Steps. Slow and steady, one after the other, circling the house. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long time, I didn't move. Just stood there, staring at the door, listening to the faint sound of snow crunching outside. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. Maybe it was the wind after all, or an animal passing by. That's what I told myself, even as I locked the doors and checked every window. But the next morning, when I stepped outside to take a closer look, the tracks were still there. Perfectly round imprints, leading from the snowman in our yard to the edge of the woods, and back again. At the time, I didn't say anything. What could I say? That a snowman was walking around our house at night? I would have sounded crazy. So I kept it to myself, pushing the thought out of my head as best I could. But that was just the beginning. It wasn't until the second night that I realized I wasn't imagining it. This time, I woke up to the sound of faint knocking. Not on the door or a window, but something dull and heavy tapping against the walls of the house. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the snowman was there again. Only now, it was closer. Right at the edge of the porch, staring up at my window. Its face wasn't the same anymore. The cheerful, uneven smile we had carved into its head was gone. The mouth was wider now, too wide, and the eyes looked deeper, darker somehow. I closed the curtain as fast as I could and sat there in the dark, gripping the edge of my blanket, waiting for morning. I didn't sleep that night. By the time the sun came up, the snowman was gone. All that remained were deep, heavy footprints leading back into the woods. I wanted to tell someone, my parents, my friends, anyone, but how could I explain what I had seen without sounding insane? So, I stayed quiet. And for a while, I thought maybe that was the end of it. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. The next few days passed quietly, but the tension didn't leave me. Every night, as the town settled into its usual frozen stillness, I found myself lying awake, listening. Listening for that faint crunching of snow or the soft knocks that I'd convinced myself were just my imagination. But nothing happened. At least, not right away. Then, on the fourth day, I saw something I couldn't ignore. I was walking home from school with my best friend, Kevin. The snow was falling lightly, and the air had that sharp, brittle cold that stings your face. We were talking about a project due next week, something normal, something mundane, when Kevin suddenly stopped. "Hey," he said, pointing ahead. "Isn't that your snowman?" I followed his gaze. There, standing in the middle of the empty playground across the street, was a snowman. It looked eerily similar to the one we had built in my yard days ago, the same misshapen head, the same unevenly packed body. I tried to laugh it off. Yeah, right. A lot of snowmen look alike. But as we walked closer, my stomach twisted into a knot. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The same tilted stick arms, the same jagged stones for buttons. It was ours. Kevin noticed it too. "Dude, did you move it here or something?" I shook my head, my voice tight. "No. I haven't touched it." We both stood there, staring at the snowman. It wasn't facing us directly, instead, it was angled slightly to the side, as if it had been caught mid-turn. Its coal eyes seemed to sink deeper into its face the longer I looked. Kevin must have sensed how unsettled I was because he tried to change the subject, brushing it off like a prank. "Probably some kid messing with you. They saw it in your yard and dragged it over here to freak you out." I nodded, not because I believed him, but because it was easier than explaining the truth. We kept walking, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Even when we turned the corner, I could still feel those coal eyes watching us. That night, I decided I needed answers. After dinner, I went to my dad. He was sitting in his recliner, half asleep with the news on. "Hey, Dad," I started, trying to sound casual. "You ever hear about anything weird happening around here? Like, with snowmen?" He raised an eyebrow but didn't look away from the TV. "Weird how?" "I don't know," I said, my voice faltering. "Like, people moving them around. Or them, I don't know, showing up where they shouldn't." He finally turned to me, his face wrinkled with confusion. "What are you talking about? Snowmen don't just move on their own." I felt stupid even asking, but I pressed on. "What about the woods behind our house? Has anyone ever talked about strange stuff happening back there?" His expression changed slightly, just for a second. A flicker of something, discomfort, maybe, crossed his face before he shook his head. "No. Nothing like that. You've been watching too many movies." I wanted to push further, but his tone made it clear the conversation was over. Later that night, I did something I'd never done before. I snuck out. I waited until the house was silent, my parents asleep, and crept out the back door with a flashlight. The snow crunched softly under my boots as I made my way toward the edge of the woods. My breath hung in the air, each exhale catching the light from my beam. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. But something about those footprints from days earlier, the ones leading into the trees, had stuck with me. I needed to see where they went. The woods were unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling branches, just the faint hum of my own breathing and the soft crunch of snow. I followed the trail as far as I could, but it wasn't long before the footprints disappeared, swallowed by the untouched snow. I stood there for a while, scanning the trees, trying to convince myself to turn back. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, so soft I almost missed it. A low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy being dragged through the snow. I swung the flashlight around, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of light swept over the trees, over the snow, over nothing. But the sound was getting louder, closer. And then, just at the edge of the light, I saw it. Not a person. Not an animal. A snowman. It was standing between two trees, motionless, its blank face staring directly at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought it was the same snowman from the playground. But this one was different. Its body was more jagged, its surface packed unevenly like it had been thrown together in a hurry. Its arms were longer, twisted branches that seemed to stretch toward me. And its head was tilted so far to the side it looked broken. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Seconds. Minutes. It felt like hours. But then it moved. Not a lot. Just a small, almost imperceptible shift of its head, like it was listening. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my yard, gasping for air, my legs burning from the cold. When I finally looked back, there was nothing there. Just the dark line of trees and the faint glow of snow under the moonlight. I went inside, locked every door, and didn't sleep a single minute that night. But the worst part? The next morning, when I opened the curtains, there was a snowman in our yard. It wasn't the one we built. It wasn't the one from the woods. This one was new. And it was closer. The snowman wasn't just a few feet closer. It was right there, barely 6 steps from my window. It stood rigid, leaning slightly forward, as if it had been frozen mid-step. I couldn't look away. Its coal eyes seemed darker than before, sunken into its uneven head. The mouth, once a harmless curve of pebbles, had shifted into something else. A straight line, sharp and deliberate, almost like it was clenched in anger. I stood there, staring through the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The snow was untouched around it, no footprints, no signs that anyone had moved it. It was as if it had just appeared. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind or some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew better. That day at school, I couldn't focus on anything. Kevin noticed, of course. "You alright, man? You look like you didn't sleep." I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That a snowman was stalking me? It sounded ridiculous, even in my own head. Yeah, I lied. Just didn't sleep well. Kevin didn't push it, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. By the time school ended, I was ready to go straight home, lock the doors, and pretend none of it was happening. But when I stepped outside, I stopped cold. There, across the parking lot, was another snowman. This one wasn't as close, but it was the same. The same uneven body, the same jagged stick arms, the same dark coal eyes. It was facing the school entrance, standing perfectly still. I felt my stomach drop. "You see that?" I whispered to Kevin. He looked where I was pointing and shrugged. "It's just a snowman." "What about it?" "It wasn't there this morning," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kevin frowned, glancing at me. "You sure?" "I mean, it's just a snowman, dude. Maybe someone made it during lunch or something." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as we walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that those coal eyes were following me. That night, I decided I couldn't stay quiet anymore. After dinner, I sat my parents down and told them everything. The snowman, the footsteps, the one that moved closer to the house. My dad frowned, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "Jake, are you feeling okay? Maybe you've been spending too much time inside. A little cabin fever, maybe?" "It's not cabin fever." I snapped, louder than I meant to. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong. The snowmen, they're not normal. They're not." "Enough," my mom said, cutting me off. Her voice was calm, but her expression was firm. "Jake, it's just snow. Maybe someone's playing a prank, but there's no reason to scare yourself like this. We'll keep an eye out, okay? But you need to let it go." "Let it go?" I wanted to scream. How could I let it go when every time I closed my eyes, I saw those coal-black eyes staring back at me? That night, I locked every door and window in the house. I even pushed a chair in front of my bedroom door, just in case. But no amount of locks or barricades could stop the dreams. They started as whispers. Faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to echo from the edges of my mind. Then the images came, flashes of snow-covered woods, of dark, shapeless figures moving between the trees. And always, the snowman. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare. But then I heard it. That sound again. The soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow, circling the house. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was slow, methodical, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to hear it. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on my nightstand and crept to the window. My hands were trembling as I pulled back the curtain. The snowman was gone. But the tracks were still there. They circled the house in a wide, deliberate arc before disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I finally convinced Kevin to come over. I needed someone else to see what I was seeing, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. "All right," he said, squinting at the tracks in the snow. "That's weird, I'll admit. But it doesn't mean anything, right? I mean, snow melts and refreezes. Maybe animals." "Animals don't make tracks like that," I said, cutting him off. "Look at them. They're too round, too deep. It's like something heavy was walking through here." Kevin was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, fine. It's weird. But what do you want me to do about it?" I didn't have an answer. That afternoon, we decided to follow the tracks into the woods. It felt like a terrible idea, but I needed to know where they led. The air was colder under the trees, the sunlight barely piercing through the branches. The tracks wound deeper and deeper, leading us into a part of the woods I'd never been before. "Dude," Kevin said, his voice uneasy. "Maybe we should turn back." I was about to agree when we saw it. Another snowman. It was smaller than the others, its body crooked and misshapen, as if it had been built in a hurry. But it wasn't the snowman that made my blood run cold. It was what was sticking out of its chest. A scarf. My scarf. The same one I thought I'd lost weeks ago. I didn't have time to process what I was seeing before Kevin grabbed my arm. "We need to go. Now." He didn't have to tell me twice. We ran all the way back to my house, neither of us saying a word. But as we reached the edge of the yard, we both stopped, staring in horror. There, standing in the middle of the yard, was the snowman. And it was smiling. It wasn't the kind of smile you'd expect from a snowman. Not the cheerful, uneven grin of pebbles we'd pressed into its face days ago. This was something else. The mouth was wider now, curving unnaturally upward as if the snow itself had stretched to form it. Kevin stepped back, pulling me with him. "Jake, what is this?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were looking at. The snowman stood motionless, but the air around it felt heavy, like the kind of silence you hear just before a storm. Kevin nudged me again, his voice low. "We should go inside." I nodded, tearing my eyes away from the thing in the yard. As we stepped back toward the house, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. The snowman hadn't moved, but its smile seemed sharper somehow, as if it was mocking us. Inside, Kevin paced nervously while I locked the door. "All right," he said, his voice shaking. "You're officially freaking me out. That thing wasn't there when we left, and you're telling me no one built it?" "I told you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know how it got there. But it's not the first time. They keep showing up. Closer and closer." Kevin ran a hand through his hair, looking around the room as if the answer might suddenly appear. "Okay, so, what do we do? Call the cops?" Tell your parents. And say what? I snapped. That a snowman is following me. They'll think we're crazy. Kevin didn't respond, but the look on his face said he agreed. That night, I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. Every time I heard the wind whistle or the faint creak of the house settling, I felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was just my imagination. Just paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I lay perfectly still, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the house. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand and crept to the window. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the curtain. The snowman was gone. But in its place, there was something else. A single stick, driven deep into the snow, stood upright in the middle of the yard. Tied to it was a piece of fabric. My fabric. The scarf that had been hanging on the smaller snowman in the woods. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The snowmen weren't just appearing, they were leaving messages. The next day, Kevin refused to come over. I couldn't blame him. I wouldn't have wanted to come back either. I spent most of the day inside, glued to the window, waiting for something to happen. By the time the sun began to set, the yard was still empty, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope it was over. But then, as the last light of day faded into dusk, I saw them. Not one. Not two. 3 snowmen. They stood in a line at the edge of the woods, perfectly still, their faces turned toward the house. I felt the blood drain from my face. They weren't there to scare me. They were watching. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at them. The longer I looked, the more certain I became that they were waiting for something. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house sent my nerves into overdrive. By the time morning came, the snowmen were gone again, leaving only their footprints behind. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something. I spent the entire day researching, combing through old newspaper archives and forums, desperate for any explanation. At first, I found nothing. Just the usual urban legends and folklore about haunted woods or cursed snowstorms. But then I stumbled across something. An old forum post, buried in a thread about unexplained disappearances. The user claimed to have grown up in a small town not far from mine and shared a story eerily similar to what I was experiencing. Snowmen that appeared out of nowhere. Footsteps in the night. The post ended with a warning: if you see them, don't go outside. Don't look at them for too long. And whatever you do, don't let them get too close. I felt a chill run down my spine. Too close. That evening, as the sky turned gray and the snow began to fall again, I sat by the window, waiting. I didn't know what I was hoping for, maybe a sign, maybe nothing at all. But as the minutes dragged into hours, the snowmen appeared again. This time, there were 5. They were closer now, just a few feet from the edge of the yard. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called Kevin. "They're back," I whispered. He hesitated. "Jake, you need to leave. Go somewhere, anywhere. Just get out of that house." I wanted to argue, to tell him it was ridiculous. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe anymore. Not in my own home. And as I stood there, staring at the snowmen through the window, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't just standing there. They were leaning forward. Toward the house. The snowmen were leaning forward, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make my skin crawl. Their jagged stick arms hung at strange angles, pointing slightly toward the windows as if beckoning me. Their faces hadn't changed, not at first glance, but the longer I looked, the more distorted they seemed. The coal eyes, once dark and empty, now glinted faintly in the dim light, as though something behind them was watching. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, my breath shallow and quick. They weren't moving, not yet, but their presence was suffocating. It was as though the air around me had thickened, weighing me down. I don't remember picking up my phone, but suddenly I was dialing Kevin again. The call rang twice before he picked up, his voice groggy. "Jake? What's going on?" "They're closer," I whispered, my voice shaking. 5 of them now. At the edge of the yard. There was a pause, and then Kevin's voice sharpened. "Leave. Right now. Grab your parents and get out of there." I glanced toward my parents' room down the hall. The house was dark and silent, they were probably asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding outside. "I can't just wake them up," I said, my voice barely audible. "You don't have a choice," Kevin snapped. "This isn't normal, Jake. You need to." His voice cut off suddenly, replaced by a faint crackling sound. "Kevin?" I said, my heart pounding. "Nothing. Just static." I looked down at my phone. The call was still connected, but his voice was gone. And then, faintly, I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Not loud or high-pitched, but soft and distant, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. It didn't come from the phone, it was coming from outside. Slowly, I turned back toward the window. The snowmen had moved. They weren't at the edge of the yard anymore. They were halfway to the house, their bodies tilted at awkward angles as if they'd been frozen mid-step. The closest one was now less than 10 feet from the porch. I dropped the phone, backing away from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I ran to the front door, double-checking the locks and deadbolt, my hands trembling. I moved through the house like a whirlwind, locking every door, every window, anything that could keep them out. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the quiet streets. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, overlapping and chaotic, like a chorus of children playing a twisted game. Then came the knock. It was soft at first. A single, hollow tap against the front door. I froze, staring at the door, my mind racing. It wasn't possible. The porch was empty just seconds ago. The knock came again. This time louder, more insistent, followed by the faint scrape of something dragging across the wood. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as I crept toward the door, every step slow and deliberate. When I reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the peephole. The knock came a third time, harder now, shaking the door on its hinges. I leaned forward, my eye pressing against the peephole. And there it was. A face. Not a human face, but the face of the snowman, its coal eyes staring directly at me through the tiny glass circle. Its mouth was wide now, stretching unnaturally across its misshapen head, as if it were laughing silently. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and landing hard on the floor. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, dragging sound. It was moving. Slowly, methodically, around the side of the house. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran to the nearest window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. They were everywhere. Snowmen lined the yard, the driveway, even the edge of the street. Dozens of them, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their arms outstretched like they were reaching for the house. And they were moving. Not fast, just slow, deliberate steps that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then I heard it. A new sound, faint but distinct, coming from the back door. A scraping noise, like nails against glass. I turned, my stomach twisting into knots. The back door had a small window at the top, and through it, I could see one of them. Its face was pressed against the glass, its coal eyes staring unblinking into the house. Its stick arm was raised, scratching slowly, rhythmically, against the pane. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and hurled it at the door. The glass shattered, but the snowman didn't flinch. It just kept staring, its head tilting slightly to the side as if it were studying me. The wind outside picked up, howling through the broken window. The laughter was louder now, more distorted, like it was coming from all directions at once. I didn't know what else to do. I ran upstairs, slamming the door to my room and shoving the dresser in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock on the window. For hours, I sat there, clutching my knees to my chest, listening to the sounds outside. The laughter, the knocking, the scraping, it all blended together into a symphony of madness. And then, just before dawn, it stopped. The silence was deafening. No wind, no footsteps, nothing. I waited until the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the curtains before I dared to move. Slowly, I pushed the dresser aside and opened the door. The house was eerily still. When I made my way downstairs, I found the front door wide open, snow drifting in across the floor. The yard was empty. The snowmen were gone. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The footprints. Dozens of them, leading away from the house, back toward the woods. And in the middle of the yard, half buried in the snow, was a single stick. Tied to it was a piece of fabric. My scarf. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Something about the way it fluttered slightly in the breeze made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, as though touching it would invite something I wasn't prepared to face. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the stick, trying to convince myself it wasn't a message. But deep down, I knew it was. They wanted me to know that I was still part of their game. When I finally moved, I didn't go back inside. Instead, I found myself walking toward the woods, my breath visible in the freezing air. My boots crunched softly against the snow, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The tracks were still there, a crisscrossing maze of footprints that led deeper and deeper into the forest. I followed them without hesitation, the trees closing in around me as the sunlight faded into a pale gray haze. It wasn't long before I came across the first one. A snowman, half collapsed, leaning against the base of a tree. It was smaller than the ones I'd seen before, its face worn and distorted, as though it had been left there for a long time. But its arms, twisted branches, were pointed toward something further ahead. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry as I stepped around it. The next snowman was larger, standing in the middle of a clearing. This one was intact, its features sharp and deliberate, as if it had been built recently. Its head was tilted downward, as though it were staring at something in the snow. And then I saw it. In front of the snowman, partially buried in the snow, was an old leather-bound book. I hesitated, my heart racing as I knelt down and brushed the snow away. The cover was cracked and faded, but the binding was surprisingly strong, holding it together despite the weather. There was no title, no indication of where it had come from. I opened it, the brittle pages crackling under my fingers. The writing was uneven, scrawled in a hurried hand, and the language was old, archaic, almost, but readable. The first entry sent a chill through my body. They come with the first snow, born of frozen ground and the whispers of the wind. They are not of this world. Do not look into their eyes. Do not invite them closer. And above all, do not let them follow you home. I flipped through the pages, each one more frantic than the last. The entries detailed the writer's descent into paranoia and fear, describing how the snowmen had appeared around his cabin, how they had watched him, how they had moved closer every night. One passage stood out. The snowmen are not snow, not truly. They are the frozen echoes of what was left behind. They wear the faces we give them, but they are not empty. They remember. They hunger. My hands trembled as I turned to the final entry, written in a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. I have burned them. I have salted the ground. But they always return. I will not last the night. If you find this, know that they will come for you, too. Do not build them. Do not give them form. They will take it from you. And when they do, it will be too late. The page ended there, the ink smudged as though it had been written in desperation. I looked up, the clearing suddenly feeling much darker than before. The trees seemed closer, their shadows stretching toward me like grasping hands. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. And then I heard it. The faint crunch of snow. It wasn't close, but it was steady, deliberate, moving toward me from somewhere deeper in the woods. I snapped the book shut, shoving it into my jacket and turning back the way I came. My steps were hurried, my breath coming in quick, visible bursts as I tried to retrace my path. But the snow seemed different now, the tracks I had followed earlier fading into a featureless expanse of white. The footsteps behind me grew louder. I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding, my legs burning as I pushed forward, the trees blurring together in my peripheral vision. I could feel them now, eyes on me, watching from the shadows, from behind the trees, from places I couldn't see. And then I stumbled. My foot caught on something buried in the snow, sending me sprawling forward. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me, but before I could scramble to my feet, I saw what had tripped me. Another snowman. But this one was different. Its face wasn't made of coal or stones. It was human. A real face, frozen and distorted, pressed into the snow like a mask. Its eyes, wide, glassy, and unblinking, stared back at me, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. I scrambled backward, my breath catching in my throat, but as I did, I felt something brush against my back. I turned, and there they were. The snowmen. Dozens of them, surrounding me in a perfect circle, their bodies leaning slightly forward as though ready to collapse on me. Their eyes glinted faintly in the fading light, their mouths stretching into those wide, unnatural grins. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the snowmen began to fall. One by one, they crumbled into heaps of snow, collapsing silently into the frozen ground. The woods were still again, the air heavy with a suffocating silence. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, stumbling through the snow, my legs numb, my chest burning with every breath. When I finally burst out of the woods and into my yard, the first rays of sunlight were creeping over the horizon. The snowmen were gone. But the footprints remained, stretching from the woods to the edge of the porch, where a single stick stood upright in the snow. Tied to it was another piece of fabric. Not my scarf this time. A piece of my jacket. I stood there, staring at it, my mind spinning. It wasn't torn from my jacket, I was still wearing the whole thing, but somehow, impossibly, that same piece of fabric was tied to the stick like a trophy. My breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps, clouding in the freezing air. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The house was quiet, eerily so. My parents were still asleep, completely oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded outside. I thought about waking them up, about dragging them out of bed and leaving the house for good, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was something else. I sat down at the kitchen table, clutching the old book I'd found in the woods. Its weight felt unnatural in my hands, as though it were more than just paper and leather. I flipped through it again, desperate for answers, for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The entries blurred together, frantic scrawls describing footsteps in the night, whispers carried on the wind, and snowmen that came closer and closer until there was nowhere left to run. And then, near the back of the book, I found something different. It wasn't a journal entry. It was a set of instructions, written in a calmer, more deliberate hand. To banish them, you must take back what they have claimed. Burn their effigies. Scatter their remains. But beware, if you fail, they will not forgive. My eyes darted to the window. The footprints were still there, leading from the woods to the stick in the yard. My scarf. My jacket. Pieces of me. They had claimed them. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. My mind was racing, every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and hide. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I grabbed a box of matches from the kitchen drawer and a can of lighter fluid from the garage. My hands shook as I pulled on my boots and stepped outside into the freezing morning air. The stick stood in the middle of the yard, casting a long, jagged shadow across the snow. I approached it slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached it, I hesitated. The piece of fabric fluttered gently in the breeze, almost as if it were taunting me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against it, and a sudden chill shot through my entire body. The air around me felt colder, heavier. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I didn't stop. I doused the stick and the fabric in lighter fluid, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the can. Then I struck a match, the tiny flame flickering weakly in the icy wind. For a moment, I hesitated. The words from the book echoed in my mind, "If you fail, they will not forgive." I let the match fall. The flame caught instantly, roaring to life with an intensity that seemed impossible. The stick and fabric burned brightly, the fire crackling and spitting as it consumed them. And then I heard it. A scream. Not a human scream. It was something deeper, raw and guttural, echoing through the air like the cry of a wounded animal. It came from the woods, from everywhere at once, shaking the ground beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the fire burned itself out. The stick was gone, reduced to ash, but the scream lingered, growing louder and more distorted. And then I saw them. The snowmen. They were everywhere. At the edge of the yard, at the edge of the woods, even in the driveway. Dozens of them, their bodies swaying slightly as if moved by an invisible wind. Their faces were no longer the crude, uneven features of snow and coal. They were sharper now, more defined, with hollow, gaping mouths and eyes that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. They were coming. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it. But I knew it wouldn't hold them. The book had said as much, they weren't bound by walls or locks. The house groaned as though it could feel their presence. Shadows moved across the windows, their shapes distorted and unnatural. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing through the walls like a chorus of mocking voices. I grabbed the book, flipping through the pages desperately. The instructions had worked, but only partially. I needed to finish what I'd started. The final entry was clear. The fire will weaken them, but only the source will destroy them. Find the first. Destroy its core. The first. The snowman I'd built with my friends. My stomach twisted. It was still out there, somewhere. The one we'd built, the one that started all of this. I grabbed the lighter fluid and matches, throwing on a coat as I raced back outside. The snowmen were closer now, their twisted faces watching me as I ran toward the woods. I found it where we'd left it, partially collapsed and buried in the snow. Its features were barely recognizable, but I knew it was the one. I didn't hesitate. I drenched it in lighter fluid, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struck another match. The flame caught, spreading quickly over the misshapen body. The snow hissed and melted, steam rising into the air as the fire consumed it. The scream returned, louder than before, shaking the ground beneath me. The snowmen in the yard began to crumble, collapsing into piles of snow and ash as the fire roared. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The woods fell silent. The air was still. I stood there, staring at the blackened patch of ground where the snowman had been. The weight in the air was gone, lifted as though a storm had passed. When I returned to the house, the yard was empty. No snowmen, no footprints. Just the quiet blanket of fresh snow. But as I reached the porch, I noticed something. A single stick, half buried in the snow, standing upright. And tied to it was a new piece of fabric. Not mine this time. Kevin's. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there on the porch, staring at the stick. The fabric tied to it was unmistakable, Kevin's jacket. The bright red fabric looked out of place against the pale snow, its edges frayed as though it had been ripped free with force. My mind reeled. Kevin hadn't been here. He couldn't have been. I had called him only hours ago. He was safe at home, or so I thought. My breath quickened, frosting in the cold air. The quiet around me now felt oppressive, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for my reaction. I reached out with trembling fingers, pulling the fabric free. The stick wobbled slightly in the snow but stayed upright, like a grave marker. And that's when I noticed something else. Footprints. They started at the stick and trailed off toward the edge of the woods. Not the circular, rounded prints of the snowmen, but boot prints. Human. Kevin's. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest. They led past the yard and into the forest, weaving between the trees in a chaotic, almost panicked pattern. As I walked, the wind picked up, carrying faint sounds I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just the rustling of branches, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. A voice. Kevin's voice. Jake. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I broke into a run, my boots slipping on the icy ground as I followed the prints deeper into the woods. Kevin. I shouted, my voice echoing back at me. Where are you? The only answer was the wind. The tracks led me to a clearing, one I didn't recognize. The snow here was untouched, pristine, except for the footprints that ended abruptly in the center. There was no sign of Kevin. Kevin. I called again, my voice cracking. And then I saw it. A snowman stood at the far edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. It wasn't like the others. This one was smaller, its shape hunched and uneven, as if it had been built in a rush. Something about it made my stomach turn. Its face was wrong, not just a crude smile or hollow eyes, but something more grotesque. The cold pieces were jagged, almost sharp, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as if it were laughing silently at me. And in its hand, or rather, its twisted, gnarled stick arm, it held something. Kevin's hat. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Kevin had been here. He had been taken. The snowman seemed to lean forward, its crooked head tilting slightly to one side. Where is he? I shouted, my voice shaking. What did you do to him? Of course, it didn't answer. It just stood there, watching, mocking. The anger that surged through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I grabbed the lighter fluid from my coat and marched toward the snowman, my hands trembling with rage. You're not taking him. I screamed, dousing the snowman in the liquid. I struck a match and threw it. The flame roared to life, consuming the snowman in an instant. The air filled with the hiss of melting snow and the acrid smell of burning wood. And then came the scream. It wasn't like before. This one was higher, shriller, filled with a pain that made my ears ring. It echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trees until it felt like it was coming from every direction at once. I stumbled back, clutching my ears, as the snowman collapsed into a heap of ash and water. The scream faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. And then, slowly, the shadows began to shift. At first, I thought it was the trees swaying in the wind, but the shapes were wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving with a deliberate, unnatural rhythm. They stepped into the clearing one by one, their bodies impossibly white against the dark woods. Snowmen. Dozens of them. They didn't have faces, just blank, featureless heads that turned toward me in unison. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard it again. Kevin's voice. "Jake, help me." It was faint, muffled, as though it were coming from deep within the woods, or from inside one of the snowmen. "Kevin!" I shouted, spinning around, trying to find the source. The snowmen didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. I could feel their eyes, or whatever passed for their eyes, watching me, waiting. I turned and ran, my legs burning as I pushed through the snow. The laughter started again, distant at first, then growing louder, overlapping, filling the air like a twisted symphony. I didn't stop until I was back at the house. The yard was empty, the stick gone. Inside, I locked every door and window, barricading myself in the living room. The old book sat on the table where I'd left it, its pages open to the final entry. They will always take something. If not you, then what you love. Do not let them inside. Do not follow their voices. My hands shook as I closed the book, the weight of its words settling over me. Kevin was gone. I knew that. But I also knew I couldn't leave him. Not like this. The snowmen hadn't come back, not yet. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the empty yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't finished with me. And then I saw it. Far at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the moonlight, was a single snowman. And it was waving.